The first laugh came from the woman wearing diamonds, but the second one hurt more because it came from the man who had once promised Emily Carter he would never let anyone make her feel small. By the third laugh, the entire Whitmore family had decided that her old navy dress was the funniest thing in the room. Emily stood just inside the carved oak doors of the Whitmore Estate Library, one hand resting on the strap of her worn leather purse, the other smoothing the front of a dress she had owned for nearly 9 years. The hem fell just below her knees. The fabric had faded at the seams. One sleeve had been carefully repaired with thread a shade darker than the original color. It was clean, pressed, and modest, but in a room filled with black designer suits, pearl necklaces, silk scarves, and watches that cost more than most Americans made in a year, modesty looked like a confession. Daniel Whitmore saw her first. Her ex-husband stood near the marble fireplace, tall and polished in a charcoal suit, his blonde hair brushed back, his expression controlled in the way wealthy men practiced in mirrors. For one brief second, something moved across his face, not regret, not tenderness, only irritation that a chapter he had closed had walked back into the room, wearing sensible shoes. Beside him, Vanessa Whitmore turned her head slowly, letting her eyes travel from Emily's plain pumps to the soft fray near her cuff. Vanessa was Daniel's new wife, though the word new had always seemed too clean for what she was. She wore ivory silk, a diamond bracelet, and the pleased smile of someone who had never mistaken kindness for strength because she had never needed either one. "Daniel," Vanessa said, just loud enough for the cousins near the windows to hear. "I didn't know the reading allowed staff to sit with the family." A small, bright laugh broke from Aunt Patricia first. Then Daniel's younger brother covered his mouth with 2 fingers, pretending not to enjoy it. Someone near the bookcase whispered, "Is that the same dress from the hospital benefit?" Another voice murmured, "Poor thing. Still trying to look respectable." Emily did not answer. She had learned, over the last 5 years, that silence was not weakness when it was chosen carefully. She crossed the Persian rug and took the last chair in the back row, the one nearest the rain-streaked window. Outside, the Connecticut afternoon had gone gray, the kind of heavy November gray that made even mansions look tired. Inside, the Whitmores shone like expensive silver, cold, polished, and useless unless someone else kept them from tarnishing. On the long mahogany table at the front of the room sat a sealed folder, a silver water pitcher, and a small brass nameplate belonging to Margaret Ellis, Richard Whitmore's personal attorney. Richard had been Daniel's father, the patriarch, the founder of Whitmore Holdings, and the only person in that family who had ever looked at Emily without calculating what she was worth. Emily slipped her hand into her purse and touched the envelope hidden inside. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and old-fashioned, the kind Richard preferred because he said email made people careless with their souls. It had arrived 3 weeks before his death, delivered by courier to the tiny apartment Emily rented above a florist shop in Hartford. She had almost opened it a dozen times. But Richard had written only one sentence across the front in his shaking hand. "Open this only when they laugh." At the time, she had thought it was strange, maybe even cruel. Now, sitting beneath the weight of every smirk in the Whitmore library, Emily understood that Richard had known his family better than any of them knew themselves. Daniel glanced back at her, his jaw tightening, as if her quietness embarrassed him more than Vanessa's insult. "You didn't have to come," he said. His voice carried just enough concern to sound decent to strangers, and just enough contempt for Emily to recognize the man underneath it. Emily looked at him, then at Vanessa, then at the sealed folder on Margaret Ellis's table. "I was invited," she said. 2 words. Calm. Small. Final. Vanessa smiled again. By mistake, probably. This time, Emily did not lower her eyes. She held the envelope inside her purse like a pulse, feeling the edge of Richard's last message against her fingers. She had come expecting discomfort, perhaps pity, maybe a few poisonous whispers dressed as manners. She had not expected the old dress to become a spectacle before the will was even opened. But then Margaret Ellis entered the room, silver-haired, straight-backed, carrying a second black folder under her arm. The laughter thinned at once. The attorney placed her glasses on the bridge of her nose, looked across the gathered family, and paused when her eyes reached Emily. It was not surprise in Margaret's face. It was recognition. Then, very slowly, the lawyer nodded. as if confirming that Emily had come exactly as someone had hoped she would. Emily's fingers tightened around the envelope. For the first time that afternoon, the Old Navy dress did not feel like an embarrassment. It felt like evidence. Margaret Ellis did not sit down immediately. She stood behind the mahogany table with both hands resting on the black folder, studying the room with the patient disappointment of a woman who had spent 40 years watching families become strangers the moment money entered the conversation. The Whitmores settled into their chairs with practiced importance. Aunt Patricia crossed her ankles and adjusted her pearls. Daniel's brother, Charles, whispered something to his wife that made her press her lips together to hide another smile. Vanessa placed one hand over Daniel's sleeve, a delicate little claim of ownership, as if Emily had come to steal back a man she would not have taken for free. Emily kept her eyes on Margaret, but she could feel the room measuring her. They measured the dress, the purse, the plain wedding band she no longer wore, but still felt sometimes like a pale mark on her memory. 5 years earlier, this same library had smelled of cedar, lemon polish, and Richard Whitmore's pipe tobacco, though he had stopped smoking long before Emily met him. Back then, she had stood beside Daniel under the portrait of his grandfather while the family toasted their marriage with champagne shipped from France. Richard had taken her aside that night, pressed a warm hand around hers, and said, "Do not let this house teach you to apologize for having a heart." She had laughed then because she did not understand warnings when they arrived dressed as kindness. She understood now. Margaret opened the first folder and removed several pages, each one marked with neat blue tabs. "Before we begin," she said, her voice low but clear, "I will remind everyone present that Richard Whitmore requested this reading be held privately, without press, without company representatives, and without interruption." Her gaze shifted for half a second toward Daniel. Those were his exact instructions. Daniel leaned back, pretending boredom. "We understand, Margaret. Father always enjoyed ceremony." "Your father enjoyed precision," Margaret replied. The correction was small, but the room heard it. Vanessa's smile thinned. Emily looked down at her purse. The envelope inside seemed heavier now, as if Richard's handwriting had gained weight with every insult spoken in the room. She could still remember the day the courier brought it. Rain had been hitting the windows of her Hartford apartment, and she had been sorting overdue invoices from the Community Literacy Center where she worked part-time. The envelope had arrived without warning, no return address except the name of Richard's law firm. Emily had held it for nearly 10 minutes before turning it over. "Open this only when they laugh." She had almost called Margaret then. She had almost called Daniel too, which proved grief could make even intelligent women consider terrible decisions. Instead, she tucked it into a drawer beneath old photographs and tried not to think about it. But the words had followed her for 3 weeks. They followed her through grocery aisles, through quiet evenings over canned soup, through the memorial service where the Whitmores placed her in the 6th row behind people Richard had barely tolerated. They followed her into that library, and now they seemed to breathe against her fingertips. "Are we waiting for someone?" Charles asked, glancing at his watch. "Some of us have flights tonight." Margaret did not look at him. "No. Everyone Mr. Whitmore required is present." Required, not invited. Emily again. That is generous language. Emily finally opened her purse. Not quickly, not dramatically. She simply unfastened the brass clasp and slipped her fingers around the envelope. Daniel noticed first. His eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Emily withdrew it and rested it on her lap. The cream paper looked almost luminous against the faded navy fabric. A letter from Richard. The room changed. Not loudly. No one gasped. The Whitmores were too well trained for that. But Aunt Patricia stopped touching her pearls. Charles stopped checking his watch. Vanessa's hand tightened on Daniel's sleeve. Daniel looked at Margaret, and for the first time since Emily had entered, uncertainty broke through his polished expression. "Father wrote to you?" he asked. The question was not curiosity. It was accusation. Emily looked at the handwriting on the envelope, then back at him. Apparently. Vanessa gave a soft laugh, but this one had no audience. How sentimental. Did he also leave instructions for the dress? Emily slid one finger beneath the flap. The old glue gave way with a dry whisper. Inside was a single folded sheet. She opened it carefully, aware that every eye in the room had moved from her clothes to her hands. Looked at documents. People who felt threatened looked at the person who might benefit from them. "Margaret," Daniel said. attempting a smile that had convinced investors, reporters, and judges at charity dinners for most of his adult life. Perhaps we should keep this focused. My father was ill during his final months. We all know grief can make people attach importance to things that were never intended to matter. Margaret's eyes lifted. Your father was evaluated by 2 independent physicians and 1 estate psychiatrist before signing the final documents. His mental capacity was confirmed 3 times. The room became very still. Emily felt the sentence move through the Whitmores like a clean blade through ribbon, not harming anyone, simply cutting away the decorative lies. Aunt Patricia shifted in her chair. Charles looked down at the rug. Vanessa's expression did not break, but the diamond bracelet on her wrist gave a faint sound as her fingers tightened. Emily had heard versions of Daniel's argument before. During the divorce, he had called her emotional when she asked about missing bank statements. He had called her confused when she found Vanessa's name buried in company travel records. He had called her dramatic when she cried in the kitchen after learning that the savings account she thought was theirs had been emptied into a business fund she had never authorized. It was always the same magic trick. If Daniel could not erase the truth, he tried to make the person holding it seem unstable. For a moment, the library dissolved around her, and Emily was back in the sterile white hallway of St. Anne's Medical Center, wearing that same navy dress, her hair falling loose from its pins, Richard's blood pressure monitor beeping softly behind a curtain. The Whitmores had been at the annual hospital benefit downstairs, laughing under chandeliers, posing for photographs beside oversized donation checks. Richard had excused himself halfway through dinner, pale and sweating, but nobody noticed except Emily. She had followed him into the corridor, found him gripping the wall, and called for help before pride could kill him faster than illness ever would. Later, when the doctors said she had acted in time, Daniel had kissed her forehead in front of everyone and called her his angel. By morning, he was angry because the incident had embarrassed the family. Richard remembered. Then the line of his mouth flattened. Then his fingers, resting on the arm of his chair, curled inward as if he could hold the entire room still by force of habit. The advisory board, he said. That was all he left me in the foundation? Margaret turned a page. Your father was very clear. My father built that foundation as part of Whitmore Holdings. No, Margaret said. He funded it separately after your mother died. It was never a corporate asset, despite several attempts to treat it as one. Charles looked sharply at Daniel. Aunt Patricia inhaled through her nose, a tiny sound, but in that room it landed like a dropped glass. Emily had not known that detail, but she knew Daniel well enough to recognize the shadow passing behind his eyes. It was not grief. It was calculation interrupted. Vanessa recovered first, because Vanessa had always been quicker when a room needed rearranging. Margaret, surely Richard intended Daniel to continue the family legacy in a meaningful way. The lake house and a few cars are sentimental, but they are not responsibility. Responsibility, Margaret repeated, almost gently. That word appears often in Mr. Whitmore's final notes. Emily felt the paper in her lap tremble and realized it was not the paper. It was her hand. She lowered it against the faded navy fabric, pressing her palm flat until the shaking stopped. Her mind was not in the library anymore. It was moving backward, pulling open doors she had kept locked because survival had required a certain amount of forgetting. She remembered the night Daniel came home at 2 in the morning smelling of rain and Vanessa's gardenia perfume, though he told her she was imagining things. She remembered the breakfast meeting where he introduced Vanessa as a promising consultant and smiled at Emily, as if daring her to recognize the truth in public. She remembered the divorce papers arriving in a white envelope so thick it felt less like paperwork and more like a verdict. Daniel's attorneys had called her requests unreasonable. They had said the townhouse was purchased through family trust structures she did not understand. They had said the investment accounts were complicated. They had said the marital assets were limited, even though Emily had spent 7 years hosting donors, managing household staff, caring for Richard after his surgery, and pretending not to notice the way Daniel's ambition consumed every room he entered. What she remembered most was Richard sitting across from her in a quiet corner of the hospital garden after the settlement was signed. He had a wool blanket over his knees and an oxygen tube beneath his nose, and he looked smaller than a man with his name carved into buildings should have looked. I failed you, he had said. Emily had shaken her head because comforting wounded men had once been her unpaid profession. No, Richard, this is not your fault. He had looked at her then with those pale gray eyes that missed very little. That is what decent people say when indecent people benefit from their silence. She had not known how to answer. So she had adjusted his blanket and told him the roses were blooming early. Now, in the library, Margaret removed a small remote from beside the folder and turned toward the paneled wall behind her. A framed landscape painting lifted slowly, revealing a flat screen hidden inside the wall. Vanessa gave a startled laugh that died before it became anything useful. He recorded something? Daniel asked. He recorded several things, Margaret replied. But this one was marked for today. She dimmed the lamp nearest the table. The screen came alive with a soft blue glow. Then Richard Whitmore appeared. Seated in the sunroom, Emily remembered, a plaid blanket across his knees, his white hair combed neatly, his hands folded over the silver handle of his cane. He looked tired, but not confused. Frail, but not weak. His eyes seemed to move across the room, finding each person he had left behind. When he spoke, his voice was rough at the edges, yet unmistakably his. If you are watching this, then Emily came. And if Emily came wearing the navy dress, then my family has already made fools of themselves. No one moved. Emily forgot to breathe. On the screen, Richard gave the faintest smile. I know that dress. I know because she wore it on the night she saved my life while the rest of you were downstairs being photographed beside my money. Richard's recorded voice filled the library with the calm authority he had carried even when his body began to fail him. That night at St. Anne's, I learned something I should have understood years earlier. Some people stand beside you when cameras are flashing. Others stand beside you when no one is watching. On the screen, his hands shifted slightly over the cane handle, the movement slow but deliberate. Emily stared at him, feeling the room disappear around the edges. She had not seen this version of Richard before, not exactly. In her memory, he was always half reclined in a hospital chair, teasing the nurses, asking for coffee he was not allowed to drink, pretending not to be afraid whenever the machines changed their rhythm. But here, even beneath the pallor and the tired eyes, he looked prepared. Not for death, perhaps, but for truth. Emily did not save me because she wanted anything, Richard continued. She did not call reporters. She did not ask the hospital board to know her name. She did not remind my son that while he was protecting his image, she was protecting my life. Daniel looked away first. It was a small movement, but Emily saw it. So did Margaret. So did Vanessa, whose hand slowly withdrew from Daniel's sleeve, not in sympathy, but in calculation. The foundation of the room had shifted, and Vanessa had always been skilled at stepping away from unstable ground. Richard's image leaned closer to the camera, his gray eyes bright beneath heavy lids. Over the last 4 years, I watched what happened after my son ended his marriage. I watched a decent woman be painted as greedy because greed needed a disguise. I watched attorneys turn confusion into surrender. I watched my family accept a convenient story because the truth would have required discomfort. Aunt Patricia made a sound that might have been protest, but Margaret lifted one hand without looking away from the screen. The sound stopped. Emily's throat tightened. She had spent years telling herself that being misunderstood was survivable. She had built a small life out of quiet routines, bus rides, thrift store furniture, library shifts, Tuesday night soup, and the relief of no longer waiting for Daniel to come home with another beautiful life folded into his coat pocket. She had not known how badly she still needed one person from that old world to say she had not imagined it. Richard did. From the screen, he gave her that gift without asking her to beg for it. This dress, Richard said, and his mouth curved faintly, was mentioned in my instructions because I knew my family. I knew they would see fabric before they saw character. I knew they would see age before they saw loyalty. And I knew Emily, if she came at all, would come as herself. Not decorated for approval. Not disguised for acceptance. Herself. Emily lowered her eyes to the navy fabric. For years, she had kept the dress because it was practical, because it still fit, because replacing clothes had not been a priority when rent, groceries, and car repairs had to be measured against every paycheck. She had never allowed herself to think of it as sentimental. Sentiment was expensive when a woman was rebuilding her life one overdue bill at a time. Yet now the dress carried an entire history inside, it seems. A torn hem in an ambulance, Richard's hand gripping hers in a hospital room, Daniel's public gratitude turning to private resentment by breakfast, the beginning of a truth no one else wanted named. Margaret has documented everything necessary, Richard said. Medical records, correspondence, estate revisions, and my statements regarding why I made the decisions you are about to hear. If any member of this family attempts to challenge Emily by attacking her character, they will find that I prepared for that too. Charles swallowed hard. Aunt Patricia stared at the carpet as if it had suddenly become fascinating. Vanessa sat perfectly still, but the color had drained from the careful warmth in her face. Daniel finally looked back at Emily, and for one strange second, she saw not the polished heir, not the husband who had discarded her, but a man realizing that the room no longer belonged to him simply because he expected it to. Richard's voice softened. Emily, if you are watching this, I am sorry I waited until paper and law could say what I should have said when you were still part of this house. You were never the embarrassment. Our silence was. The screen went dark. No one breathed for a moment. Then Margaret Ellis turned on the lamp, lifted the final pages from the folder, and looked directly at Emily. Margaret did not rush. She let the dark screen hold its silence for 3 full seconds, long enough for the Whitmore family to sit with the echo of Richard's final sentence, long enough for every polished watch and diamond clasp in the room to become strangely irrelevant. Then she lifted the last set of pages from the folder, squared them against the table, and began to read. I, Richard Allen Whitmore, being of sound mind and acting without pressure, coercion, or undue influence, hereby revoke all prior estate distribution plans dated before March 15th of this year. Daniel's head snapped up. March 15th. His voice was sharp enough to cut through the old library air. That was after his second hospital stay. Correct, Margaret said. It was also after his final capacity evaluation. He was weak, Daniel said. He was tired. Margaret looked at him with a sadness that somehow felt colder than anger. Many tired people still know exactly who disappointed them. No one corrected her. Emily sat very still, the letter resting open on her lap, Richard's words visible beneath the soft yellow lamplight. Let them finish laughing. Margaret has the truth. She thought of all the years she had mistaken endurance for dignity. How many dinners had she smiled through while Daniel corrected her in front of his friends? How many charity luncheons had she attended in borrowed confidence, carefully learning which fork to use, which donor's wife hated being called by her first name, which cousin could not be seated beside which uncle, because old money had more rules than compassion. She had believed that belonging could be earned through grace. The Whitmores had taught her that some families did not want grace. They wanted witnesses who would never testify. Margaret continued, To my son, Daniel Whitmore, I leave the assets previously stated, along with my hope that limits may teach. What abundance did not? Daniel stood. This is insulting. Sit down, Aunt Patricia whispered, but her voice had lost its usual authority. No, Daniel said, though he did not move toward Margaret. This is not what he wanted. This is Emily's influence. Emily looked at him then, not with anger. Anger would have been easier for him to understand, easier to dismiss as bitterness. She looked at him the way a person looks at a house they once lived in after realizing the roof had always leaked. I had no idea what was in that folder, she said. You expect us to believe that? Vanessa asked, her voice smooth again, though too smooth now, like ice over water. You appear here in the exact dress he mentioned, carrying a mysterious letter, and we are supposed to believe you are innocent in all this? Emily's fingers tightened once around the edge of the paper, then relaxed. No, Vanessa, I do not need you to believe anything. The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle Vanessa more than any accusation could have. Margaret turned another page. To Emily and Carter, formerly Emily Carter Whitmore, I leave the controlling interest of the Whitmore Family Foundation, including all voting authority, all real property assigned to the Foundation Trust, and the unrestricted charitable endowment currently valued at $68 million. The sentence entered the room quietly. It did not explode. It did not need to. It settled over the silk chairs, the mahogany shelves, the oil portraits, and the people who had spent the last 20 minutes laughing at a dress that had just outlasted every jewel in the room. Charles made a sound under his breath. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her pearls and stayed there. Vanessa stared at Margaret as if language itself had betrayed her. Daniel did not speak at all. His face had gone pale beneath the careful tan he maintained year-round, even through Connecticut winters. Emily heard the number, but it felt distant, almost unreal. $68 million was not a figure her life had room for. Her life had room for rent due on the 1st, gas at $3.89 a gallon, store-brand coffee, and the small satisfaction of fixing her own kitchen sink, because calling a plumber meant choosing between convenience and groceries. But Richard had not given her money, not exactly. He had given her responsibility, trust, a burden wrapped in vindication. Margaret was not finished. In addition, Mr. Whitmore leaves to Emily Carter the residence known as Whitmore House, including the surrounding 12 acres, with the recommendation that it be used for a purpose more honorable than family vanity. The library became so quiet Emily could hear rain sliding down the glass. Daniel finally found his voice, but it was smaller now. He left her the house? Margaret met his eyes. No, Daniel. He left her the choice of what this house becomes. For a long moment, no one understood what to do with the choice. The Whitmore family knew how to inherit, how to possess, how to protect a name engraved on stone, glass, and annual reports, but choice was different. Choice required imagination. It required the possibility that a house could be more than proof that one bloodline had been luckier than most. Emily looked toward the tall windows, where the rain blurred the bare maple trees beyond the lawn into streaks of brown and silver. 12 acres. She knew those acres. She had walked them in heels during summer parties, carrying polite conversations like trays of fragile glass. She had crossed them in snow boots after Richard's first surgery, pushing his wheelchair along the paved garden path, because he said the house smelled too much like people pretending not to be afraid. She had sat with him beneath the copper beech tree while he told stories about Daniel as a boy, before money had taught him that charm could be used as a weapon. And now those acres, that house, that library where she had once felt like a guest in her own marriage, had been placed into her hands. Daniel rose fully this time. His chair scraped against the floor, an ugly sound in a beautiful room. This is absurd, he said. Emily cannot manage a foundation of that size. She works at a literacy center. Emily almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because Daniel had once again mistaken service for smallness. Margaret adjusted the papers in front of her. Mr. Whitmore noted her experience with nonprofit grant coordination, community programming, elder care advocacy, and financial oversight for 3 local education initiatives. Daniel looked at Emily as if she had committed some private betrayal by becoming competent without his permission. You never told me any of that. You never asked, Emily said. The words were quiet, but they found every corner of the room. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice careful now. Margaret, there must be conditions. Richard was a practical man. He would not simply hand over an estate and a multi-million-dollar endowment without safeguards. There are safeguards, Margaret said. A professional board will remain in place. Annual audits are required. Major property decisions must meet the charitable purpose clause. Emily holds voting authority, but not unchecked private ownership of foundation assets. Vanessa's shoulders lowered a fraction, as if she had found a door in a burning room. Then she cannot sell it. No, Margaret said. She cannot sell it for personal gain. Daniel exhaled, bitter and relieved. So this is symbolic. Margaret's expression sharpened. No, it is structural. The word seemed to strike harder than any insult could have. Emily understood it at once. Richard had not given her a trophy to display in front of the people who mocked her. He had given her a mechanism, something built to keep helping after the room stopped watching. The thought steadied her. Money alone would have frightened her. Power alone would have disgusted her. Purpose, however, was something she recognized. Purpose had carried her through years when pride could not. Margaret turned the final page. There is one additional provision. Mr. Whitmore established a legal review fund within the foundation, separate from the charitable endowment, to examine financial misconduct affecting vulnerable spouses, caregivers, and elderly dependents. He requested that the first review concern records from Daniel and Emily Whitmore's divorce proceedings. The room shifted again, but this time it was not shock. It was exposure. Daniel went still. Vanessa's face lost its polish. Charles looked at his brother with a new attention, the kind people give a locked drawer after learning there may be something inside. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. My divorce? She asked. Margaret's voice softened for the first time. Richard believed assets had been concealed from you. He did not want to accuse without evidence. He gathered documents and authorized independent counsel to determine whether legal action is appropriate. Daniel's lips parted, but no polished answer came out. Emily remembered the thick divorce papers, the cold conference room, the attorney who spoke to her as if kindness had made her mathematically illiterate. She remembered signing because Richard had been recovering, because Daniel said a long fight would damage the family, because she had been too tired to understand that exhaustion was exactly what they were counting on. Margaret slid a sealed packet across the table. "This is for you. You are not required to decide anything today." Emily looked at the packet, then at Daniel. For years, she had imagined justice as a dramatic thing, a raised voice, a public apology, a door slammed hard enough to echo. But justice, she realized, could also be a sealed envelope on a mahogany table, waiting calmly until a woman was ready to open it. Daniel spoke at last, and his voice had changed. "Emily, we should discuss this privately." She looked at him in the same room where his family had laughed at her dress. "No," she said. "You had privacy when you took things from me. The truth can have witnesses." Daniel stared at Emily as though she had become a stranger in the span of a single sentence, but that was not true. She had been becoming a stranger to him for years, quietly, invisibly. Every time she paid a bill with money she had earned herself, every time she slept through a night without waiting for his key in the door, every time she learned that peace did not require anyone's permission. The difference was that now he had an audience for his discovery. Vanessa recovered enough to laugh once, softly, a sound polished for drawing rooms and charity luncheons. "This is becoming very emotional," she said. "Perhaps that is not the best atmosphere for legal decisions." Margaret closed the folder halfway, not enough to end the matter, only enough to remind the room that she controlled the pace. "No legal decision is being requested from Emily today. Mr. Whitmore arranged representation for her through an independent firm in Boston. They have already received the preliminary documents." Daniel's expression sharpened. "You sent our private records to outside counsel?" "Richard sent copies of records he legally possessed," Margaret said. "The firm will determine what is relevant." Charles leaned back slowly, looking at Daniel with a kind of reluctant fascination. "What records?" Daniel did not answer. He did not have to. The silence filled in shapes Emily had spent years trying not to see. Accounts renamed before mediation, business valuations adjusted downward, a trust structure explained to her, with patient condescension by men who were paid by the hour to make exhaustion sound like consent. At the time, she had believed signing was the mature thing, the merciful thing, the only way to leave without destroying what little dignity remained. Now she understood that dignity had not been preserved by her silence. It had simply been stored somewhere else, waiting for the right witness. Aunt Patricia finally spoke, and her voice had lost the sharp little edge it carried when mocking address was still easy. "Daniel, is there something we should know?" He turned on her with a look so cold Emily remembered it from their marriage, the look he used when someone had inconvenienced his version of reality. "No, there is nothing." Margaret slid another document from the folder. "Then the review should be simple." Vanessa's gaze moved from Daniel to the sealed packet, then back again. For the first time all afternoon, she looked less like a woman wearing diamonds and more like a woman counting exits. The two papers looked ordinary together, almost harmless. One held apology, one held possibility. Neither could give back the years she had spent doubting her own memory, but they could mark the place where doubt ended. Daniel stepped away from his chair. "Emily, listen to me. This will hurt everyone. My father was grieving. He was angry. Whatever he thought he knew, he did not understand the pressure I was under. There it was, the old music. The pressure, the responsibility, the burden of being Daniel Whitmore, heir to rooms full of people ready to excuse him before he finished explaining. Emily had once mistaken that music for tragedy. Now she heard only rhythm, predictable and empty. "I do understand pressure," she said. "I understood it when I was sitting in a mediation room with two attorneys telling me I was confused. I understood it when I packed my clothes into 3 suitcases because the townhouse I helped make into a home was suddenly not legally mine. I understood it every time your family invited me to disappear quietly and called it grace." Daniel's face tightened. "You signed the agreement." "I signed what I was told was true." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Them neatly back into the folder. Then Mr. Whitmore's instructions for today have been fulfilled. Emily looked once more at the library, at the shelves, the portraits, the fireplace where Daniel had stood laughing beside another woman's insult. She had entered that room as an afterthought in an old dress, with his wife following close behind. Aunt Patricia paused near the fireplace, one hand touching the mantel where generations of Whitmore men had posed for portraits with dogs, rifles, sailboats, and all the other props wealthy families used to confuse inheritance with character. "Emily," she said, and the name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth without contempt attached to it. Emily waited. Patricia's lips pressed together. Perhaps she had meant to apologize. Perhaps pride had blocked the exit. In the end, she only said, "Your dress is not as old as I thought." Then she walked out, leaving behind the faint scent of powder and defeat. Vanessa watched the exchange with cool impatience. "Sentimentality is expensive," she said. "You may discover that soon." Emily turned to her. "No, Vanessa. Sentimentality is what people call love when they are afraid it might cost them something." Vanessa's face hardened, but she had no clean answer to that. Daniel finally stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. Once, Emily would have measured that distance by longing. Now she measured it by relief. "I made mistakes," he said. The words were careful, selected from the safest shelf. "We both did." Emily almost laughed, but not from amusement. From amazement that some men could divide a house in half, sell one half, burn the map, and still call the ashes shared responsibility. "No," she said. "You made choices. I made excuses for them." Daniel's expression tightened. "You think Richard was a saint? He knew how this family worked. He benefited from it." "Yes," Emily said. "And near the end, he tried to become honest about it. That does not erase everything. But it matters." Outside the library, voices murmured in the hallway, smaller now, stripped of laughter. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the windows bright with late afternoon silver. Emily stood and picked up her purse. The old dress moved softly around her knees, no longer a target, no longer a disguise. Margaret handed her a business card with a handwritten number on the back. "The attorneys in Boston are expecting your call tomorrow. Take tonight for yourself." Emily looked at the card, then at the room where she had once tried so hard to belong that she mistook discomfort for ambition. "I think I already took something today," she said. "Not money, not the house. Something quieter." Margaret's expression softened. "Your name?" Emily glanced once toward Daniel. He looked suddenly tired, almost ordinary, a man without chandeliers to enlarge him. "No," she said. "My version of the story." Then she walked out of the Whitmore library, past the portraits, past Vanessa's silence, past Daniel's unfinished regret, carrying 2 envelopes in a worn leather purse, and wearing the same old navy dress that had survived every room that tried to shame it. The hallway outside the library felt longer than Emily remembered. Maybe it had always been long, lined with portraits and polished tables and silver-framed photographs of people who had mastered the art of looking permanent. Or maybe she had changed. 5 years earlier, she had walked that same hall with a suitcase in each hand, her chest hollow, her marriage reduced to legal language, and the sound of Daniel's voice telling her not to make things harder than they needed to be. Back then, every portrait had seemed to watch her leave as if exile were a family tradition. Now the eyes in the frames looked smaller, trapped inside gilt borders, unable to follow her into the life Richard's final act had opened. Margaret walked beside her, not too close, carrying the black folder against her chest. "There will be calls," she said quietly. "Daniel will call. So will people representing him. Some will sound apologetic. Some will sound practical. Some may sound concerned for your well-being." Emily gave a faint smile. Concern was always very popular in this family when control stopped working. Margaret's mouth moved as if she might smile too, but she remained professional. "Do not answer anything tonight. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to meet privately. The Boston attorneys will contact you tomorrow at 9 o'clock Eastern Time." Emily nodded. 9 o'clock. Such a normal hour for a life to become complicated again. She thought of her apartment above the florist's shop, the crooked kitchen drawer, the radiator that hissed in winter, the small table where she paid bills with a blue pen and a calculator she trusted more than most men in suits. By tomorrow morning, she would still wake up there. The ceiling would still have a water stain shaped vaguely like Ohio. Her coffee would still come from a can bought on sale. But something invisible had shifted beneath all of it. Poverty had not ended in the library, and neither had pain. But the story that made her small had lost its legal protection. At the front of the house, the butler, Mr. Alden, appeared near the entrance with her coat folded over one arm. He had been with the Whitmores for 22 years and had always treated Emily with a quiet respect that embarrassed her because she had received less from the people who called themselves family. His hair was thinner now, his shoulders slightly rounded, but his eyes were kind. "Mrs. Carter," he said, then corrected himself gently. "Ms. Carter." "Emily is fine," she said. He held out her coat. "Mr. Whitmore spoke of you often in the last year." The sentence stopped her more effectively than Daniel ever had. "He did." Mr. Alden nodded. "Mostly on Sundays. He would sit in the sunroom and ask whether the Literacy Center had received the winter grant, whether your car was still making that noise, whether you had fixed the loose step outside your apartment." Emily looked down, suddenly unable to pretend the day had not reached the softest part of her. Richard had known about the car, the step, the small humiliations of ordinary survival. Not because she had told him, but because he had cared enough to ask someone. "I wish he had called," she said. "So did he," Mr. Alden replied. "But he said you had earned a life without Whitmore voices in it." Emily closed her eyes for a second. Behind her, footsteps approached, measured and familiar. Daniel. She did not turn until she had put on her coat and buttoned it from bottom to top. When she faced him, he looked different in the hallway than he had in the library. Without the fireplace behind him, without Vanessa at his side, without the room arranged to confirm his importance, he was only a man standing beneath his grandfather's portrait, trying to recover ground. Already washed away by rain. "Emily," he said, "please. 10 minutes. Margaret remained beside her, silent but unmistakably present. Emily touched the strap of her purse, feeling Richard's letter inside. "You had 7 years of marriage and 5 years after that," she said. 10 minutes is not where honesty begins. Daniel swallowed. "I did not know he had gone this far. That is not an apology." His eyes lowered briefly. "I am sorry you felt abandoned." There it was, polished and useless, an apology built to avoid admitting the thing it circled. Emily felt no anger this time, only distance. "I was not abandoned because I felt it, Daniel. I was abandoned because you left. There is a difference." He had no answer. For once, she did not provide one for him. She stepped past him toward the front door. Mr. Alden opened it, and the cold November air entered the house clean and sharp. Emily walked outside in her old navy dress and thrifted coat, carrying a worn purse that held 2 envelopes capable of undoing years of lies. Behind her, the Whitmore estate glowed with expensive light. Ahead, the wet driveway curved toward the road, silver under the clearing sky. She did not look back until she reached her car. And when she did, no one was laughing. Emily drove back to Hartford with both hands on the steering wheel and the radio off. The highway was wet, the late afternoon traffic moving in slow silver lines beneath a sky that had not decided whether to clear or collapse again. For the first 10 miles, she felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not even fear. The body, she had learned, sometimes delayed emotion the way a careful accountant delayed bad news, placing it in a drawer until there was enough quiet to open it. By the time she reached her apartment above the florist's shop, the streetlights had come on, glowing against the damp brick sidewalks. Mrs. Alvarez, who owned the shop downstairs, was pulling buckets of unsold chrysanthemums away from the front window when Emily came in through the side entrance. "Long day?" she asked, taking one look at Emily's face. Emily paused with one hand on the stair rail. She could have said yes. She could have said Richard. "Whitmore left me a foundation, a mansion, and a legal storm wrapped in cream paper." She could have said the people who laughed at my dress stopped laughing when the will was read. But some truths were too large to carry up a staircase in casual conversation. "Long enough," she said. Mrs. Alvarez nodded, because women who had lived real lives knew when not to ask for details in public. "I made soup. Too much. There is a container by your door." Emily's throat tightened again. "Thank you." Upstairs, her apartment greeted her with the ordinary kindness of things that did not judge. The radiator clicked. The small lamp beside the couch cast a warm circle over a stack of library books. The ceiling stain still looked like Ohio. On the kitchen counter, beside the promised container of soup, lay an overdue electric bill and a grocery receipt folded under a chipped blue mug. Emily set her purse down as carefully as if it contained something fragile enough to shatter the floor. Then she removed Richard's letter, Margaret's card, and the sealed packet from Boston. She placed them on the table in a neat row. Apology, guidance, evidence. 3 pieces of paper, each one heavier than jewelry. For a while, she simply stood there in the old navy dress, listening to the building settle around her. Downstairs, the florist shop bell jingled once. Somewhere below, Mrs. Alvarez laughed with a customer. Normal life continued, shameless in its persistence. Emily went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was pale, tired, and still wearing the dress everyone had laughed at before it became inconvenient for them. A loose thread hung from the repaired sleeve. She touched it gently, then laughed once, softly, not because anything was funny, but because the universe had a terrible sense of timing. After years of trying to look respectable in rooms built to reject her, the very thing they mocked had become the thing that proved she had never needed their approval. The phone rang at 7:32. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Emily watched it until the call ended. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Then a message appeared. Please call me. We need to handle this wisely. She stared at the word wisely and thought of mediation rooms, hidden accounts, polite threats, and the exhausting way powerful people renamed their panic as wisdom. She turned the phone face down. At 8:15, another message arrived, this time from an unknown number. Vanessa. Emily did not open it. At 9, she warmed the soup, changed into sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. Across the top, she wrote Whitmore House. Under it, without thinking too long, she wrote 3 phrases: legal aid for abandoned spouses, emergency housing for women and children, elder care advocacy. The words looked impossible and strangely familiar. They were not revenge. Revenge would have been smaller. Revenge would have ended with Daniel humiliated and Vanessa quiet. This was larger, and therefore more frightening. This meant building something useful from the ruins people expected her to worship. At 11, Emily finally opened Richard's letter again and read the last line, the one she had missed in the library because shock had narrowed the world. Beneath the sentence about Margaret having the truth, Richard had added one more thought in smaller handwriting. Do not let them make you cruel. Make them irrelevant. Emily pressed the paper against her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, Hartford went quiet under the wet November night. Tomorrow, attorneys would call. Documents would surface. Daniel would try to manage the damage. Vanessa would calculate her distance. The Whitmore family would begin rewriting their version before breakfast. But inside the small apartment above the florist shop, Emily Carter took off the old navy dress, folded it carefully, and placed it over the back of a chair, not as evidence anymore, not as armor, but as the first honest witness to the life she was about to build. The next morning arrived without ceremony, because life rarely understands when it is supposed to provide music. Emily woke before her alarm to the thin gray light slipping through the blinds and the smell of flowers rising faintly from the shop below. For several seconds, she forgot. Then she saw the navy dress folded over the chair, Richard's letter on the table, and the sealed packet waiting beside her untouched coffee mug. The world returned all at once. At 9 o'clock exactly, the call from Boston came. The attorney's name was Rebecca Lowell, and her voice was calm in the way Emily had once wished every lawyer's voice could be, steady enough to hold truth without turning it into a weapon. Rebecca explained that Richard had provided copies of trust documents, business valuations, emails between Daniel and the family attorneys, and records suggesting several marital assets had been excluded from the divorce disclosure. Nothing would happen overnight. There would be filings, requests, responses, delays, and predictable attempts to settle quietly. You do not need to decide your emotional position today, Rebecca said. Only your legal one. Emily stood by the kitchen window, watching Mrs. Alvarez unlock the florist shop downstairs. My legal position is that I want the truth reviewed properly, she said. And my emotional position is that I am done making silence convenient for other people. Rebecca was quiet for a beat. That is a clear place to begin. By noon, Daniel had called 4 more times. By 2, a formal email arrived from his attorney expressing concern about preserving family dignity. Emily read it once, then forwarded it to Rebecca without replying. The old Emily would have drafted 3 versions of a response, each one softer than the last, trimming the truth until it could fit inside someone else's comfort. That woman had been kind, but she had also been tired. Emily did not hate her. She simply would not ask her to come back. Over the next 6 weeks, the Whitmore name began to change shape in Emily's life. It was no longer only a locked gate, a cruel room, or a signature at the bottom of papers she had not understood. It became meetings with foundation board members, site inspections, financial briefings, and long evenings at her kitchen table reading bylaws with a yellow highlighter. She learned which parts of Whitmore House could be converted safely, which offices could become counseling rooms, which guest suites could become temporary family housing, and how many legal clinics could be funded in the first year without weakening the endowment. The numbers were enormous, but the needs were larger. Women called from shelters. Elder advocates sent reports. A retired judge offered to volunteer once a month. Mrs. Alvarez brought coffee and said the house should have fresh flowers in the entrance, not expensive ones, living ones. In January, Emily returned to the estate for the first board vote under her authority. Snow covered the 12 acres in clean white silence, softening the lawns that had once hosted parties where she felt invisible. Daniel was not there. Vanessa was not there. Aunt Patricia sent a handwritten note, stiff but legible, donating the pearl brooch Richard had left her to the foundation auction. Charles attended quietly and voted yes on every motion. When the final resolution passed, Whitmore House was officially renamed the Richard Whitmore House for Women and Families. Emily walked outside afterward and stood beneath the copper beech tree, its branches bare against the winter sky. She was wearing a wool coat over the same old navy dress, repaired sleeve and all. Not because she had nothing else now. She had bought 2 new suits, sensible shoes, and a winter coat that did not come from a clearance rack. She wore the dress because some things deserved to witness their own ending. Margaret stood beside her, hands tucked into leather gloves. Richard would have liked this, she said. Emily looked at the brass plaque newly mounted beside the front doors. It caught the pale afternoon light, modest but permanent. I hope so. You did not keep the house for yourself. Diamonds, no performance, no need to prove she belonged there. The navy dress remained in her office, folded inside a glass case beside a small card that read, "What people mock often tells you more about them than about you." Months later, Daniel sent a letter. A real one, not an email managed by counsel. He wrote that he was sorry. Not sorry she felt abandoned. Not sorry things became complicated. Sorry for lying. Sorry for letting others humiliate her. Sorry for calling control love. Emily read it twice. Then she placed it in a drawer, not as forgiveness, not as revenge, simply as proof that some truths arrive late and still do not get to choose the ending. On the first anniversary of Richard's death, Emily stood in the front hall of the house as sunlight poured through the windows and children's voices echoed from a room that had once been used only for formal dinners. No one laughed at her dress anymore. No one looked at her as if she had entered by mistake. And perhaps that was the quietest justice of all. Not that the Whitmores had finally seen her worth, but that Emily Carter had stopped needing them to. By the second anniversary of Richard Whitmore's death, the house no longer felt like a monument to people who mistook wealth for virtue. It smelled of coffee, printer ink, fresh flowers, and the faint lemon polish Mr. Alden still insisted on using every Friday morning because, as he told Emily, dignity should never be confused with dust. The grand dining room had become a legal clinic with long tables, donated laptops, and shelves of plain language guides explaining custody, estate planning, housing rights, and financial disclosure. The sunroom where Richard had recorded his final message now held a circle of soft chairs where older adults met with advocates who listened before they advised. The upstairs guest suites, once reserved for donors who drank too much champagne and called it generosity, had become temporary rooms for women and children who needed somewhere safe, quiet, and warm while their lives were being rebuilt piece by careful piece. Emily moved through the halls that morning with a clipboard in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other, wearing a charcoal blazer, low heels, and the same calm expression that had once been mistaken for weakness by nearly everyone in Daniel's family. Her hair was pinned back, for women returning to school after financial abuse or family abandonment. Daniel resigned from the Foundation Advisory Board before the report became public. Vanessa filed for separation 6 months later, citing irreconcilable differences, which Emily thought was a strangely elegant phrase for discovering the man you married was less profitable than advertised. She did not celebrate either event. Celebration would have tied her peace to their decline, and she had worked too hard to make her life bigger than their consequences. Near sunset, after the last appointment ended, Emily walked to her office. The old navy dress rested in its glass case beside Richard's note, and the small card visitors often stopped to read. What people mock often tells you more about them than about you. A little girl from one of the upstairs rooms stood in front of the case, studying the dress with solemn attention. "Was it a princess dress?" she asked. Emily smiled. "No, it was just a dress." The girl frowned, unconvinced. "Then why is it in a case?" Emily looked through the glass at the repaired sleeve, the faded seams, the hem that had once torn on an ambulance step, the fabric that had survived laughter, shame, law, grief, and finally transformation. "Because one day," she said, "some people thought it proved a woman did not belong in a room." The girl looked up. Were they wrong? Emily's smile deepened, quiet and certain. "Very." Outside, the front doors opened and closed as another family arrived, carrying bags, questions, and the fragile hope that someone might finally tell them the truth without charging them for cruelty. Emily turned from the case and went to meet them. Behind her, the dress remained where it belonged, not as a relic of humiliation, but as proof that dignity can survive being laughed at, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone was foolish enough to underestimate.